Presentation is Synesthesia Inspiring Creativity, Understanding Synesthesia and its Effects on Creative Ability. What is synesthesia? Using multiple senses at once is not uncommon. Multisensory integration describes the brain's ability to use combined senses to perceive the world around us. The brain can process more than one sense at a time, and each of the senses triggers a specific sensation. For example, if you see something and hear something, you are perceiving two sensations at once. But you might be thinking, if it's normal to use multiple senses at once, then what's so special about synesthesia? Well, with synesthesia, what happens is the brain receives a single sense, producing a sensation for that specific sense, but also triggers another sensation from another sense that was not received in the external. For example, and what happens commonly is a sound is being produced and heard and perceived, and colors are seen, but there's no visual perception. Only the auditory is picked up. So one single sense is perceived, but produces two sensations of two different senses. While synesthesia has no known advantage for survival, scientists believe there's an artistic advantage for those with synesthesia. With that being said, let's find out what research is telling us about this phenomenon. So what does the research say about it? As could be presumed, synesthesia affects cognitive functions. While there is improved performances, such as heightened color perception, there's also some difficulty with things like speech perception and deliverance. Scientists have found increased gray matter in the left posterior of the fusiform gyrus, responsible for improved performances, and a decreased gray matter in the anterior of that same gyrus, which relates to impairments relating to speech. The variants of synesthesia. There are various different types of synesthesia, but the two most common classifications are developmental and acquired. Developmental synesthesia is that the person has the gene and it often runs in a family line. There is more consistency in the symptoms, and it usually lasts their whole life. Now, acquired synesthesia is related to people who already have some sort of neurological disorder or induced by a psychotropic drug. So this could be those with disorders such as autism or even epilepsy, which would mean they would have inconsistent synesthetic experiences that change frequently, and they probably wouldn't have as much structure to the perceived senses as a synesthete would. And for those who are actively consuming a psychotropic drug, obviously they would only experience synesthesia whilst taking the drug. There are over 60 different types of synesthesia, grapheme color synesthesia being the most common with a 64.4% prevalence in those with synesthesia. Grapheme color involves sensations such as tastes, smells, temperatures, personalities, and emotions, and all can occur in the same synesthetic experience. The synesthetic colors generated in grapheme color aren't random and follow a system, as well as a psycholinguistic mechanisms of language processing. So your language rules. Another categorization for varying experiences is the associators and projectors. Those with synesthesia who are considered associators have a synesthetic experience perceived internally, whereas with projectors, the experience is perceived to be existing in the external space. Musical colors. Studies show evidence of a blue color being perceived by synesthetes when a piano is played. Previous studies chalked this up to being because the piano triggers and tugs on blue, sad feelings and emotions. But in this specific study, they concluded that the color was produced based on the initial percussion heard when the piano is played. The study found that synesthetes had a more consistent and structured association of colors. However, not every synesthetes is as consistent. Different types of instruments are also responsible for the consistent perception of specific colors. The study also found that when more powerful octaves play, the colors change to opposite colors. They also found that a higher pitch was more saturation of color, resulted in more saturation of color perceived, and with a lower pitch, it was not loud enough to produce the perception of the bright color. They still would see the color, but not as saturated as they would with a higher pitch. Enhanced memory. With some synesthetes, this study saw a prevalence in the ability of these individuals to spell words backwards and confidently. One woman expressed that she saw the image of the word in her head clearly and could read off the letters in either direction, forward or backward. Not only could she spell the word backwards, but could even pronounce it backwards clearly. Very impressive, if you ask me. Some of the synesthetes showed no issue with the length of the word, which commonly trips up those without synesthesia in memory. In this study, they also attempted to distract the synesthetes with an offset words or letters that were unrelated to the actual words or letters to be focused on, and expected the individuals to take to the distraction. However, they didn't see this result. The study saw this resilience to these distractions and even found that in memory tasks, the individuals were able to complete it faster when an auditory distractor was involved. The researchers believed this phenomenon could be because the individual has a dominance in their visual perception over auditory perception, but they concluded that this would need further research to determine if this was the case. Synesthetes dreaming. Dreaming is already a very interesting topic with so many theories and so many reasons as to why we dream. With synesthesia, it's a wonder how these individuals experience dreams. Researchers already see a commonality among synesthetes to naturally be open to experiences, creativity, and fantasy proneness, which in previous studies have been linked to the individual experiencing more narratively complex and emotionally rich dreams. These individuals were concluded to having more lucid and controllable dreams than those who don't have synesthesia. Researchers took into account imagery ability and fantasy susceptibility already present in synesthetes as well, and still found this conclusion to be true. The researchers targeted 4 themes of dreams to explore within the synesthetic dreaming experience in a more specific manner in future studies as opposed to simply focusing on effects. They are interpersonal regret, violent conflict, digital, and diverse worlds. These themes were also based upon the differences in thematic experiences of the dreams of the individuals with synesthesia. The gaps. As with any research, there is often gaps and questions that arise and unanswered questions that should have been answered. With this research, I was a little disappointed as I wasn't able to find any research on how synesthesia affects creative ability of these individuals. I was hoping to find more information about the heightened creative ability in synesthetes being able to create more easily and efficiently with things like effortless strokes of a paintbrush or gracefully playing an instrument to create a beautiful tone. However, a lot of the research did show the ability of synesthetes to have more creative thinking and experiences related to music and to other sensory experiences, but not so much on the ability of actually being able to create music and art in itself. Another issue I found with a lot of the research, and even in several of the resources I used, stated that there's a potential heightened creativity with those who have synesthesia, but none of the resources were about that specific topic of being more creative or thinking more creatively because of synesthesia. The dream content article stated that their research was more exploratory, and so their conclusions were not so much their findings, but questions they presented as prompts for the future studies that needed to be addressed. This was the case with many of the resources, often stating they needed further studies in quite a few areas. While some of the research found benefits to having synesthesia, there wasn't much emphasis on how synesthesia enhanced memory. I would have liked to have seen more studies on the advantages of having synesthesia and how individuals with it perform better in areas of creativity or in memory. And in what ways are they exceeding those who don't have synesthesia? I would also want to see more research on the interaction between the disorders and synesthesia. Many of the resources state that they are correlated, but not much of the research has described how synesthesia and a disorder could potentially affect one another. It also brought interest to me as to whether or not synesthesia shows prevalence in disorders such as ADHD and ADD. With the article about the advantages of synesthesia and it discussing how they were unaffected by audio or visual distractors and performing better on a memory task when a certain sound was played, gave me reason to think that maybe ADHD and ADD have a lot to play with the synesthesia. Often with ADHD and ADD, there are various stimulants being picked up, so it becomes a natural strategy of the person with ADHD or ADD to become resilient to those distractors. It would be interesting to see synesthesia and ADHD having a link. It might even help to understand the ADHD mind even further. Okay, and that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening and for reading the slides. Yeah, and that's all. All right.